Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us for today's PTRC Fireside Chat. Just a quick introduction to PTRC. We are the training company based in the UK which specializes in the training of transport professionals, engineers, designers, placemakers. We run a conference every year called the Transport Practitioners Meeting, and I'm very happy to announce that we have launched the call for papers for next year's event. I'll put further information for that in the chat. PTRC is part of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, the membership organization for professionals leading the movement of goods and people. Since April 2020, Glenn and I have had some amazing conversations with people during these fireside chats, and looking forward to today's discussion on serious games. I'll hand it over to Glenn now, who'll be your chair for the discussion.
Thanks very much, Brogan, and hello everyone. Welcome back to the PTRC Fireside Chat series. And our latest event, number 14 indeed, in the series. My name's Glenn Lyons and I'm the Macdonald Professor at Future Mobility at the University of the West of England, Bristol in the UK. Thanks ever so much for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy the session. Please be sure, those of you who are seasoned fireside chatters will know, please be sure to get involved during the event by using the chat bar to raise issues and questions. That will be indelibly captured on YouTube afterwards for others to view. Today, we're here to talk about the importance of play in a world rocked by a pandemic and in a transport sector beset by wicked problems. Let's face it, we could do with some fun to lighten the mood at the moment, couldn't we? But this is not play as a distraction from the important work to hand, but as an aid to that work. The dictionary definition of game is an activity one engages in for amusement or fun. Some of us look fondly back on amusement arcades before the dawn of home computing, where Space Invaders was a game providing the fun. The dictionary definition of serious is demanding or characterized by careful consideration or application. My goodness, do we have some demanding issues to address in the transport sector right now, calling for our careful consideration. Put the two together, and you create a recipe for being able to give careful consideration to a demanding issue in an engaging and fun way, a serious game. I'm delighted to be joined today by a panel of fellow gamers, professionals who understand the power of games as a form of engaging people. We'll come to them shortly, but first I'd like to offer up some further remarks to help set the scene. As you'll be aware, games come in all sorts of forms, and serious games are no exception. They can be played by one or many players. They may be games that last for minutes, hours, or days. They may be online or offline. The main differentiator between a game and a serious game is, according to Wikipedia, that a serious game has a primary purpose other than pure entertainment. They're designed to be educational in one or more ways, for players to learn from the game, for them to learn from each other, and for the game designers to learn from the players playing the game. They generate insights and empirical evidence. They're fun and they're useful. But are they scientific and methodologically rigorous, some may ask? Come on, get serious. Let's take a carefully designed questionnaire survey in which the analysts are at pains to highlight representativeness of the sample and the statistical significance of their results. This may appear rigorous, but is it really helping us learn enough about the complex and evolving world around us? A town hall consultation event may appear to have followed due process and provided a well-constructed opportunity for the public to have their say on new proposals. But did it get behind the issues and bring contrasting perspectives together in a constructively challenging way to be learnt from? Did it have a broad enough appeal to attract a good cross-section of people to take part? A set-piece conference format of 20-minute presentations followed by 10 minutes of questions may still endure, but is it realising the potential for knowledge exchange and fulfilment among those taking part? We often lament our inabilities as transport professionals to communicate and engage effectively enough to help support the progress we hope can be made in shaping a better future. Maybe serious games are one of the keys to addressing this. If we keep on doing what we've always done, we'll get what we've always got, won't we? So my money is on us making more use of participatory methods that engage people in serious tasks in a fun way. I'd like to quote Tim Gent, who's another serious gamer friend of mine from Atkins. He says, "There's something about declaring something a game which opens people up and gets them talking. And as you'll hear in a moment, the sorts of serious games those on the panel today are interested in are those that get people together in a room in a structured way. Perhaps serious games reconnect us with our childhoods. To quote the 16th century French philosopher Michel de Montaigne, it should be noted that children at play are not playing about. Their games should be seen as their most serious-minded activity." Now, it has been a tradition of our Fireside Chat series that there are no slides involved. By exception, we're going to break with that tradition today. Each of us will have one slide as part of our scene setting to introduce you very briefly to a serious game. So we move from the abstract to the specific in our panel discussion. I'd like to kick things off by introducing you to, and if the slide could be put up now, please, Tap SWOT in a box. Let's just wait for it to pop up. Here it comes. And as we go to slideshow, perfect. Tap SWOT in a box. TAP stands for Triple Access Planning, a new variation to transport planning that I and others have been promoting. But is this approach worth a transport authority taking seriously, particularly in England with the prospect of a new round of local transport plans ahead? What are its strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats? This fast-paced game, Tap SWOT in a box, invites people to assume the role of employees of a transport authority who have been charged with bringing a reasoned recommendation to their Director of Transport Planning as to whether or not the authority should adopt triple access planning. The card deck has 4 suits, S, W, O, and T. As a team, the players have to iteratively reduce down the deck of 40 issues cards to the most important 5 issues that form the basis for their recommendation to the boss. So far, the game has had a road test with success, I would say, at the annual Transport Practitioners meeting that Brogan mentioned at the start, and the European Transport Conference earlier this year. But enough from me. Now let's move on to our panelists, and I'll hand over first of all to Bex.
Hi everyone, thank you Glenn for hosting the session. So I'm Bex Posner, I'm a psychologist and I'm currently the head of social and behavioural research at the Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles, which is an expert unit within the UK's Department for Transport. A key part of my role is understanding the varying needs of transport users to help us build future transport systems that have those requirements embedded in them, and therefore building the necessary evidence to ensure that when my colleagues are developing policies and regulations, they have the most robust evidence base to do so. As part of that, I'm always striving to find ways through which we can improve our evidence base, and that's where serious games came into it. When we're conducting research, if we just use the same methods all the time, such as traditional surveys or one-time interviews, the type and depth of data that we'll be able to collect will always be the same, leaving us with substantial evidence gaps. One of the ways to ensure that we are getting the most actionable insight out of research is to spend longer time with participants and vary our methods of data collection, providing people with an opportunity to learn about a topic so that we can get both those immediate spontaneous reactions and those more informed and deliberated views. But when doing so, we are at higher risk of participants disengaging from the research, getting bored, or even completely frustrated if it feels like the methods are repetitive or we're asking them the same questions time and time again. This is where participatory methods such as serious games can come in to help facilitate our more in-depth discussions. Now, serious games not only provide that variation, but it also increases involvement. It changes the nature of research from something quite serious or that can be perceived as daunting, either because people are worried about saying the wrong thing, the views of others, or generally just speaking up, to a more relaxed environment where people can take on the various roles and work together to achieve an end goal. Serious games don't just help to reduce participant disengagement, they actually help to increase engagement overall. They can make people feel more comfortable, more settled, breaking down that seriousness that comes with research, which leads to them being more engaged. It also provides a more equal environment, ensuring that groups that are traditionally either harder to engage with or generally less likely to speak up in a group-style discussions are fully involved. Serious games provide an opportunity for people to think about the practicalities and the complexities of introducing changes in the transport systems. It provides an opportunity for them to understand the range of people that need to be involved or consulted on, the different groups that may have competing priorities, and how one action can have very different impacts on different groups. It also allows us to understand where there are commonalities, and when there are limited resources, which there often are, what should be prioritized and what are the necessary trade-offs that need to be considered. More generally, it provides participants with the opportunity to learn more about a process and consider the viewpoints of others, or maybe identifying outcomes or concerns that they had not previously considered but need to be recognized and addressed. A serious game provides the framework for all of these different elements to be considered without overwhelming participants for a long series of questions. It also enables us to get that depth of data that can be hard to achieve through other methods. It helps bring to light assumptions that members of the public can have, but don't often communicate or can find very hard to communicate. Ultimately, it provides us with the framework to move away from blue sky thinking to that more realistic and practical outcomes. Now, to give you an example, and hopefully the slide will come up on a second, one of the recent games that we've developed is a scenario development game, where ultimately, I think there might be some tech issues, so I'm just going to keep going and hopefully it will come up at some point, but no need to worry about that. So, as I said, the game that we've developed is a scenario development game, where ultimately we are looking to build up to people designing their own future scenario, outlining the different agents that need to be involved and actions that need to be put in place and prioritized to make that scenario a reality. The game is a board game style, so it's very accessible. It includes a series of cards where you present people with a starting scenario, as well as a number of different trends, which are broader things that are happening in society that need to be taken into consideration. So these could be things like decarbonizing transport, cost of living, for instance. People are then given a role at random from a series of roles that we've developed. So these range from national government, local government, a charity representative, a local business, so on and so forth. And they're presented with a range of action cards. They then have to pick one and explain to others why they think that that is the best action to implement. Once everyone has had a go, the group has to come together as a whole and must decide on just 2 actions to take forward. The consequences of those actions are then introduced and discussed. The next step sees us taking a 20-year jump in the future where a challenge has occurred. So for instance, this could be a collision involving a self-driving vehicle. Participants then have to start again and pick another action from the remaining ones, and as before, agree on 2 actions as a group. We then have our finished scenario, which is our starting base, the 4 actions that have been introduced, and we discuss what has happened and the outcome of that. All of that effectively gets us to round 2, which is when participants become the designers. They can design their own base scenario and new roles if they think some perspectives weren't taken into consideration, and equally introduce new actions that they can present to the group. Ultimately, ending up with a scenario that represents what they, as a group, think should be the future. While the game isn't specific to any location, when we have played the game in the past, we encourage participants to think about their local transport. This is to help ground them and get more of an insight into their own needs and priorities. So overall, serious games, I believe, are a really valuable asset that bring a wide range of strengths to both research, but also more broadly to stakeholder engagement. It allows us to create a more comfortable and enjoyable environment to enhance that participant discussion and obtain more in-depth understanding of assumptions and the views, as well as that more practical and actionable insight that we need to help build our evidence base and ultimately better policies. And in my opinion, it's something that all researchers should have in their methods toolkit.
That's fantastic. What a great opener, Bex. Thank you. And I don't know about the rest of you in the audience, but that's whet my appetite immediately in terms of wanting to play that game. And I can't necessarily say I'd always feel the same with some other methods put in front of me. But that's really good. And we'll perhaps come back later on to the word you mentioned right at the beginning, which was robust, and the robust evidence base, and this question of, can we take serious games seriously? But let's hear from some of our other panelists now. So James, can we come over to you, please?
Thank you very much, Glenn, and good afternoon, everybody. So I am James Gleive. I am a director at my own transport planning consultancy, Mobility Lab. And the reason why I'm actually interested in serious games is I've always been interested in how transport planners do their work and the methods and tools in which we do our work. And so I'm just trying to make them become much more open, much more participatory, so we are able to bring people along the journey with us when we're trying to create sustainable, much more just futures. And obviously games has been a big part of that. So I've got to start with the question, why don't transport planners play games? The question sounds like we're robots who are 100% serious all the time. But the thing is, we do play. We all play. Whether or not whether it's playing football on a Sunday morning or whether we're doodling on a notepad whilst you're listening to another webinar, we all play. So I would probably ask the question differently. Why don't we play games in a way that makes our work better? As someone who's created 2 games of transport planners, I've often thought of this and discussed this with transport planners as we develop the games. We don't really play games as transport planners because we do serious things. Infrastructure is serious, road safety is serious, the economy, climate change, they're serious things. Games are not serious, and if they are not serious, then we should not think of them. But anyone who has actually studied people, and I'm married to somebody who works in education, and I benefit from their knowledge greatly on this, knows how important fun is and how it is more important than simply up to having a good time. More than having a good time. To start with, fun is about learning. Great games give us new skills, or it gives us a new insight into an issue. The game which I created, Future Mobility Scenario Game, focuses heavily on learning. It works by putting people in the shoes of another person, from CEO of a tech company to a school crossing patroller, and gets them to play through different scenarios. I'll come on to it in a little bit more detail in a little while, but people get the chance to explore the world and our future in a different way, from a different perspective, and they get to learn from that perspective and what the actions, what the implications are of the actions which they undertake. So we think about that learning about future worlds is a description of a scenario or a modeling report, but we learn through experience, and by playing games, we actually get to understand what the future may actually be like. And that's some of the feedback which is featured quite heavily in the scenario game. But fun is also about growing. We see this often in children who learn everything through play. For me, growing is not just about experiencing the game or understanding how it works, but it's understanding its value as you develop your transport strategy or policy. I mean, we've all experienced a bad icebreaker or an icebreaking task or a bad team game at work. And we understand, what the impact of a bad game can be, but a good game can also make things much better. In my experience with undertaking scenario planning work, games are particularly useful at 2 phases. So firstly, it's exploring the scenarios, which I mentioned previously, but also it's really good at collecting evidence. For this, I particularly recommend something called an evidence safari, where it's a simple concept whereby you get 50, 100, 200, up to 500 pieces of evidence around the room. You ask people, the participants, a question, and you get them to hunt for evidence and to come up with new policy ideas and new insight. Instant fun, instant discussion, and from it, new learning comes. Finally, it is about creativity. We like our reports, reams of data, technical drawings. It builds on our strong analytical skills as professionals, but sometimes a creative spark is needed. All it needs is simple tools, some basic rules and a general direction, and people can be amazingly creative. And to tackle issues like climate crisis, we need to be creative. So the most obvious example of this is Lego. I've lost count of a number of times where I've seen Lego used to redesign streets or to come up with a new transport policy idea. It really wins hearts and minds, gets people much more involved in the process compared to responding online to a report or to a policy idea. It really gets people thinking, it really gets people engaged. My time is almost up, so I wanted to conclude by saying this before I go on to the scenario game. There are loads of games out there. We're just going to cover just a few here. There are loads of games out there. We need games to face the challenges ahead of us, and it can play a valuable role in the work we do. This is about learning something new, growing as a profession, and using our creativity to create a better world. And why not have fun whilst doing it? So I just wanted to spend like a minute or so just introducing the future mobility scenario game. So I'm hoping that the slide will be able to pop up just soon. Yes, excellent. Brilliant. Okay, so the future mobility scenario game is very simple in its concept. Once you've developed your scenarios for what your area, your city or your country or area wants to be like, or could be like, you use this scenario game and get people to play different roles where they take actions at 5, 10, and 15 years in the future intervals in response to specific challenges. Now, they can act on their own or they can act in collaboration with other people. The idea isn't to score the most points or to do the most successful action or kind of achieve what you want to. It's to get you to think about the implications of the actions which you take on other people and how they react. So, but we also created a slightly slimmed down version of this called the card game, which is a very slimmed down version, which takes the same basic mechanic and does it in a much more accessible, very quick manner. To date, it's been trialed with everyone from city governments, Transport for London, to Uber and major companies. It's also been downloaded over 1,500 times, so it's free and available to download for you to use on the website. That's my own little plug there. So, yeah, that's kind of all I really got to say. Please go and play.
That's great. Thank you, James. And I think we've seen already in the audience somebody saying, where do I get my hands on these games? So what we'll perhaps do, not necessarily the case that all of them are immediately available, but we'll make sure at the end when the write-up comes out that we at least provide you with a breadcrumb trail to finding where these games are evolving. So thanks for that. And I love the idea, coming back to us. Perhaps we need transport planners to stop taking themselves so seriously and enjoy being big kids a bit more to really get into the meat of the serious issues that we're facing. And I was reminded actually of, as you were talking, James, of this important difference between task conflict and emotional conflict. So, where we've got people with very strongly held views and differing views, if they're simply pitted against one another in an unstructured environment that isn't designed for fun, and they don't have these assigned roles that Bex referred to, that's where you can get emotional conflict. And actually the power of serious games is helping people focus on a task and share out their differences of opinion in a non-adversarial way that promotes learning, as I think you've both mentioned. So that's excellent. So let's move on. And Maha, would you like to set some scene for us from your perspective?
Hi, everyone. Hi from the Netherlands. My name is Maha. I'm a PhD candidate at Radboud University. My PhD is focused on analyzing the potential of serious gaming to stimulate social or interorganizational learning for triple access planning under high uncertainty. To explain this shortly, I have to first explain what is triple access planning. It's basically looking at the mobility plans from the perspective of not only mobility, but also land use and digital connectivity, aiming to achieve the larger scope of accessibility to service. This wider integrated perspective can help produce more adaptive plans in the face of high levels of uncertainty, where the system elements are changing, people more focusing on mobility now, and then later they can focus on working from home for digital connectivity. The problem is that there is little or no communication between the responsible departments of these three triple access planning system parameters. So what I'm trying to do is achieve a sort of triple access thinking among the three system parameters in response to high levels of uncertainty through integrative scenario planning by means of serious gaming, of course. Maybe to make it easier, I have an example of a very inspiring game called the Sustainable Delta game. It's developed by Deltaris, which is a Dutch institution for applied research in the field of water and subsurface. It's not a mobility-focused game. It's a different thing, but it can help us in this regard. The game is developed to help decision makers think of different ways of adaptive water management under uncertainty. It focuses on their negotiation skills, their ability to reach a common decisions, their understanding of the system interdependency, and as well as exploring different futures in response to their decisions. So it's a little bit similar to the game that Rebecca presented in the beginning. Players are asked to select 2 main policies per round to deal with this water problem that they are having. However, I have a slide also, maybe we can show the slide, but it could be later. However, thank you. For this game, the difficult part is developing the future narrative of, or envisioning this future based on the player's decision. So they already exert this effort in making the decision, selecting through the cards. As you can see in the slides, there is like different sorts of decisions for long-term and short-term. So to make it more simplified and to make them envision how the future can look like, there is also a simulation model where the game is run through. So the decisions are run through the computer-based simulation models, and that is facilitated by the game facilitator. So in the serious game world, a game can be used as a simulation, like what Rebecca explained, but also can be guided with a simulation model. So there's multiple diversions here. There are many things the planners can learn from this game, but measuring that learning is a difficult part. My colleagues at Radboud University, Meryl van der Waal, along with other colleagues, have developed a framework for measuring the social learning as an outcome of this game. This framework monitors the change in players' individual perspectives through attributing them to different indicators, like their views on water security, their risk and safety. This all through monitoring their game moves, we can then see how much they learned, and then we can see how much this affected their actual policy planning process. So this is a way that shows how serious gaming can be a very effective method in learning for transitions. Yes, I'm done.
That's great. Thanks, Maha. Really like that, and particularly reminding us that, as we mentioned at the beginning, serious games can be online or offline, or indeed, as you've illustrated nicely here, they can be both. They can be a blended approach methodologically. And I think you also touched upon, and we'll perhaps come back to this, Tom Van Buren's asked in the audience, you know, he sees very much the engagement value, but what about the data capture that Bex mentioned at the beginning and others of you have referred to? And I think you've very nicely given one illustration there, Maha, where, of course, once you make it computerized, you can actually start picking up the digital trace of how people have engaged with the game. That's fantastic. Let's move on to Charles.
Hi, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'm Charles Mossoy. I'm Professor of Psychology at Aberystwyth University. I run lots of research projects that look at bringing people and stakeholders together in order to look at challenges to do with both transport and its relationship to society and relationship to health. And also, I've got an interest in all of ourselves as we age. I've got a vested interest because I want to make it nice for us all when we end up retiring from work, and we still need to get out and about. So sometimes those things come together. So sometimes I'm able to study transport, and I'm able to study it in the context of an aging society. And that's when I like my research best, I think. I think that's my most favorite part of research. So I really, that's made me look at transport in a very different way. When you examine relationships between people as they age and the transport system, you start realizing you've got to look at transport and mobility from a very different perspective than perhaps we've traditionally looked at. It becomes difficult not to look, for example, at transport in any other way than within the social context within which it's embedded. So I hope I'm not talking out of turn here. I know there's some civil engineers and some economists amongst us and in the crowd. But, you know, I think we've moved beyond those kind of elements that underpin the way we've looked at transport for ages. And we need to start looking at it within a wider psychological and social context. And I think that makes very different ways of looking at things. And goodness me, do we need different ways of looking at things in transport. The system at the moment is still dominated by a discourse where reductions in travel time, championing the private motor vehicle at the expense of the environment and personal safety and personal health has led to a very fragmented society, very much dependent on high levels of mobility. therefore very much dependent still on oil, creating fragmented society, depleted of local shops and services. And therefore we need to start looking at things really differently. So I think that's where I started to look at transport very much from the social perspective. And there's other subjects that start looking as well. It's not just psychology. You know, we've had human geography emphasizing the importance of place and putting people at the heart of transport with its mobilities approach, and cultural and elements of sociology doing the same. So a new way really of starting to look at putting people at the heart of the transport system is really important. And if we're going to do that, we need new and fresh methods and methodologies to do that, that complement perhaps some of those traditional transport modeling elements. So, you know, I'm very interested in what qualitative methods can perhaps bring to the table. And I started out in my career doing lots of interviews, focus groups, and some ethnography. So some traveling around with people on trains, on buses, and trying to get people to keep travel diaries of what they do when they're moving around the place and things like that. I still do some quantitative research. We wouldn't be psychologists if we didn't, but it's qualitative research, which I really, really love. It's revealing, it shifts quickly, it brings home differing opinion and thought, emphasizes what is really needed to make a difference in the world. It's messy, it's difficult, it's hard to pin down, a bit like real life is. So its power to evoke and tell stories is absolutely crucial, and absolutely makes it a powerful weapon, if you like, in order to make a difference to society and a difference to transport. And you learn, a bit like James said at the start, you learn from each other in doing particularly focus groups where people are there together. You learn different perspectives, you learn from one another, and people come up with different parts and different ideas of opinion that you haven't really thought about before. And I think focus groups work best when you start with dialogue. So you get people talking very much, and you're sharing that information and listening to different points of view, build relationships and deeply reflect on topics, and you can come together to plan action together. And of course, games are ideal for doing this. So really, it's an extension of my work in focus groups. The first game I ran, and you can show the slide of it now, which was way back, I think 12 years ago or so. So if you look at the slide, you'll see a much younger version of myself, but you don't have to be young to play games. You can play games at any age, because I still do. But that's me 12 years ago. A project I ran with Heba Haddad when I was at UWE, University of West of England, in Glenn Lyons' group. Physical board game designed to understand older people's driving behavior, and in particular, exploring creativity, trying to get people to think outside the box. One thing I'd noticed in focus groups, particularly with older people, was that some people talked a hell of a lot and other people didn't talk very much at all, no matter how much you could try and encourage people to do it. So the game ensured inclusivity. It got people talking who were perhaps quiet before. There's an allowance of randomness and chance to play a part in how topics were brought up to be discussed overall. So those are the premises that underpinned it. Really, it was a simple game mimicking a journey by car. So people had actual little toy car to run around the board with. You could split the attendees into different group sizes, 2, 3, or 4 groups of people, and make them chase each other around the board. And they'd collect places that they had to complete, like they'd driven to the places. And I wanted to pick up in this particular game what issues they had with driving, and then they'd match those issues they had with driving with potential future events that might take place. So some of those might be, well, what would happen if you gave up driving? What would happen if you couldn't drive any longer? What key issues are you having with driving, and how might they be overcome by modern technology like autonomous vehicles and things like that? So a real mix of stuff where people brought things together. It added an element of fun, which is important, like James said, an element of creativity. People had to come up with very good reasons for joining their cards together, their solutions to their issues. And really got people talking who were, like I said, who were quite quiet before on that front. I played games with lots of different people. So it doesn't have to be with members of the public, it can be with stakeholders as well, or even, and this works really well, it's bringing people together from different disciplines and different backgrounds to the table at the same time. And then they kind of lose a little bit of the element of the differential in power that people have, because the power comes from the game itself and things are a bit more level. So people bring their expertise and their background, but they don't bring their power, I think, when you're playing a game in that kind of way. So I don't always play games in my focus groups. Me and my team always do interactive activities when we're doing focus groups around the same elements that games might allow. So that creativity, inclusiveness, bottom-upness, the reduction in power or the spreading out of power, and allowing space for dialogue, discussion and debate is important in there. And that comes back to the earlier points about learning from one another. You know, it brings back into play the social context. That's what we're getting at here. People don't make choices in a vacuum on a model or in a spreadsheet. They make choices in a social context, and we need to reveal that, and games are good to do that kind of thing. And to make our research relevant and make a difference, we've got to consider that wider social context and bring people together in it, not just to satisfy the funders, but in order to make a difference to real life situations. It really helps with the applied context. We're really bringing people along and understanding from their perspective. So one of my projects at the moment is the Centre for Aging and Dementia Research.
Hey, Charles.
Yeah, so that I'm just going to finish with one last point. So Centre for Aging and Dementia Research, I've got a great project team there, and we recently won Best Interactive Stall at a major conference, where we used a game to collect opinion, collect attitudes, get the values of stakeholders, listen to older people's issues, bring it together. But one thing I was really pleased with, what my team came up with the name for the game and the concept was, so the Centre for Aging and Dementia Research spells CADA, so we had the game and we called it Snakes and Cadders. So I thought that was a great name for the game moving forwards. But it just shows you can use it in lots of different contexts, I think, to engage with people of different backgrounds.
Great, thank you very much, Charles. And keeping tabs as well on questions coming up from the audience, which I think as the introductions go through are very nicely touching upon many of those points. Michael Walter had asked who uses these different games, and I think you picked up explicitly on that, Charles, but hopefully, Michael, you're seeing across the introductions that in a sense it can be anyone. What I also want to come back to, and you've already touched on it a little bit, Charles, with it being a great leveler in terms of once people are in roles, it is inherently more inclusive than other methods. And I know Dawn and Hannah and others in the audience. Hannah should get a special mention. She featured in James's photograph from his game, for those of you who know Hannah. So thumbs up for Hannah being a gamer as well as Fireside Chat enthusiast. But yes, we'll come back, Dawn, to your concern, which you've raised. In fact, we were discussing yesterday as a panel this question of inclusivity, as well as coming back to Tom Van Buren's point about what evidence and how do you gather the evidence. Before we do that, last but not least, let's come to Claire and hear some thoughts from you, Claire, to kick things off.
Hi everyone, yes, my name's Claire Sheffield. I'm Director of Transport Planning at Arup Consultancy in the UK. I've got about 20 years experience in transport planning, started off in TfL and then worked as an independent consultant for a number of years. And really I specialise in developing sort of major strategies for cities and delivering large-scale long-term schemes. I co-led the development of the Mayor's Transport Strategy for the current Mayor, Sadiq Khan, and led on the production of the evidence base. And more recently, I've been the strategy and evidence lead for the Greater Manchester Clean Air Plan, developing what was potentially going to be, prior to the cost of living crisis, the largest clean air zone in the UK. So really, I specialise in developing scenario-led strategies and also ensuring that those strategies are really embedded in the way that we make decisions and the work that we're doing to make sure that those strategies are actually meaningful and the goals are realised. And increasingly, I think my experience has been, and I think this echoes what other people have been saying, that those strategies are, whilst they are transport strategies, are becoming less about transport and more about what transport means for the wider world that we live in, how transport creates the type of city that we live in, the transport's impacts on the environment and the impact of the environment on the transport network itself, how we make people more healthy through transport by encouraging physical activity. And so what we're seeing as planners is this requirement to look beyond the network, beyond sort of economics, beyond engineering, certainly beyond our modal silos, and to think really big about how transport delivers the society that we want. That's hugely challenging for us as a planning community. And it's also very challenging in terms of our relationships with the public and with our stakeholders. I've worked on the development of a number of tools and materials to assess how people will respond to different schemes, both sort of modal changes like investment in cycling, but also particularly through the years, different road pricing schemes. These schemes are nearly always hugely controversial. There's a major disconnect between what we as planners think is the inevitable future. How many conversations have you been in where people talk about, oh, well, of course we'll have to have road user charging because of the impact of electric vehicles on the loss of tax revenue? Well, I've had hundreds of those conversations at work. I certainly haven't had any of those conversations with anybody else in my life. Nobody else thinks that's an inevitable future. So there's a huge disconnect between what we see as the inevitable future as planners and what the public and our stakeholders see. Engaging with those stakeholders and the public is hugely challenging. They don't share our understanding of the issues in the first place. They certainly don't accept the necessity of the solutions that we're proposing. You know, when you're presenting a Greater Manchester-wide clean air zone as the solution to your problem, and people suggest to you that perhaps some road humps could be an alternative solution, you really know you've not started from the same paradigm really at all. The materials that we're providing to people are really technical, they're hard to understand. So how realistic is it to think that in this really complex world with really controversial solutions, which are getting even more controversial with the sort of economic position that we find ourselves in and that we're likely to be in for a number of years, is it realistic to think that the traditional forms of stakeholder engagement are going to work, or are we going to see scheme after scheme failing or facing huge opposition, legal challenge, because we haven't taken people on that journey with us? So I think there's two, which is very much echoes what people have been saying before. There's two major issues. There's us as a professional community reskilling ourselves to face the challenges that we face now. And then there's us taking the public and our stakeholders with us on that journey towards this new way of thinking and through the difficult decisions that we are likely to face. So one obvious way, as we've talked about, of doing that is through serious games. I first developed an interest in serious games through my involvement in the Demand project, which was a project that brought together the transport industry and the energy industry. Interestingly, in the energy industry, serious games are more commonly used as part of the policy development process. And I linked up with two energy experts who developed games in that sector. They run a game called the Power Trader game, which is used across many universities and other organizations. And we thought that we could develop a transport planner game that would really tackle the issues that I've been talking about already, thinking about what do we want from the transport network? How does transport network influence our cities? How do we respond to the challenges that we face? So if I could bring up the slide now, please. So the transport planner game is designed to work as a facilitated day where people are in small teams, ideally 2 or 3 people, and each of those teams is essentially the director of transport planning for a city. The idea is that you start with a city layout, and that city layout can vary to reflect the different types of challenges that cities face. You know, they may be geographical constraints on what you've got. You don't all start with the same network or the same opportunities. So each city will be different around the tables. So it's not a competitive game, because what's winning anyway? What does a successful city look like? And your cities aren't all the same in the first place. So it's very much about thinking about strategically, what's going to be your transport strategy? What are you trying to achieve? And then we revisit that through the day. And it's so interesting to see how those strategies evolve, how people start to think differently. And not everyone takes the same approach. Is growth good? Not everyone aims for growth. Sometimes people aim for keeping their city very small and contained and manageable. The city that you see on the right essentially ended up as London and was absolutely mega rail city, but not everyone takes that approach. The idea is that it's supposed to be a day away from screens, away from the normal reality. As you can see, it's a real life game with real pieces. It's really tactile. We always try and run it in a venue that feels as little like work as possible. So the venue on the right was actually at Attenborough Nature Reserve. So the view out of the window was just sort of glorious lakes. It's designed to feel calm. We don't do a big round of introductions. There's absolutely no post-its. There's no fun introductory activities that can be so off-putting for everyone. And you gradually work through a 25-year process. So essentially, broadly, in our minds, it starts in the past, in a purist world of predict and provide, where all you care about is getting everyone from A to B and reducing crowding and congestion. And it ends in the future, where we've really started to implement all of the sort of ideas that we're talking about now. We've got, automation, we've got pricing, we've got different uses of land use. And over those years, each 5 years, you implement a new plan, and you can build new infrastructure on your network. You can change the type of vehicles, the emissions on your network. You can implement policy to manage demand or to change the customer experience on those routes, change how people feel about them. Or you can or even to change land use and the way that people are choosing to travel, whether they're choosing to travel. And the idea really is that it's an opportunity to step back from day-to-day life, to level everybody out. No matter what expertise you came in with, everyone's able to play this game. We've played it with completely random members of the public, and we've played it with expert transport professionals. And frankly, they all play it in pretty much the same way, and it generates really interesting discussions. I think in response to some of the comments that are being raised in the sidebar, it is the discussions that come out of it that aren't really about the game. They're about the challenges that are the really interesting output. We've not really attempted in playing this game to actually capture those and then report them back as an outcome, but you absolutely could. And if you were using it in a sort of consultation scenario, you definitely would be able to do that. So I've randomly gone off piste onto my bit of writing, so I shall just have to make up the end. But yeah, so I think the idea is that it gets more complex over time. You end up with this really challenging environment where you have to look at climate change. You have to care about a whole wide range of things. But the game doesn't get too complicated to play, so it's fun. We've had really positive feedback from everyone who's played it. Often the feedback that we've got is that people were a bit apprehensive about coming to the event, but then it was the most fun day that they'd had, for a long time, and that they felt really refreshed and really stimulated. And I think a hugely important point about gaming is that being in a creative and stimulating environment creates ideas, and it frees people up to think differently. And it means that you don't have to think about the specific challenge where you may have very fixed views. You can think more broadly. So I would say that games like this have got a huge opportunity, both for helping us as planners improve our expertise and for working with the public and our stakeholders and bringing them with us on the journey and really finding out what they think about what we can do. So yeah,
great.
That's me.
Thanks very much, Claire, and thanks everyone. One of the things I think is, of course, self-evident with a panel like this, we haven't brought anyone on to the panel who thinks serious games are a waste of time. So you've got a degree of evangelism from those of us in front of you on screen. And I think, Claire, you made a couple of points which I want to kind of build on, and maybe I'll pass it back across initially to Bex. But it did strike me that if we think about fun games, if you've never played poker before and someone says, hey, let's play poker, you don't immediately get the pleasure out of playing. Or, hey, have you played Dungeons and Dragons? I mean, that it's almost like a wall descends for me because I don't know how to engage with it. So, and there's also an element of self-selection, of course, that the people who are in the room, we perhaps take for granted, thinking, well, everyone's like them. They all love games out there. And we've got this great mix of society in with us. So I want to come back, as you can probably gather from this segue, to Dawn Miley's point, amongst others, which is how do serious games help in the process of not only being a leveler, so that you don't have he who shouts loudest having the biggest say, but also getting that diversity of people in the room. And of course, that's referenced against, I suppose, some not always very impressive approaches we've had as our norms in the transport sector. So, Bex, your views on inclusivity and participation, are there any tools?
Absolutely. And I think, firstly, Dawn raises a really, I think it was the first of the questions, which was around how do we cater for groups that may have additional requirements and needs, for instance, people from whom English may not be their first language, if we're playing it in the UK, people who may have visual impairments, or and so on. And I think that's a really good challenge to all of us, that, if we want to build these games and bring these games into part of our research toolkit, we need to make sure that they are designed inclusively and that can be amended if they need to be amended to cater for the needs of the different audiences that we're engaging with. So, for instance, through some of the research that we've done recently, we had a core audience, and then we also had additional audiences which were grouped traditionally underrepresented. And in one of our groups, we had higher rates of poor literacy. And so we had, as a team, to identify ways through which we could amend it so that people didn't feel uncomfortable when they were playing a game, that we weren't drawing attention to it, but they could still be as embedded and as involved as possible. And that's our responsibility as researchers, as facilitators, to make sure that if we are putting a tool out there that we are using as part of participatory methods, that by trying to provide and design a tool that is actually trying to increase comfort and increase and change the nature of research, make it less daunting, we're not actually introducing more barriers to certain groups. So I think there's an underlying assumption there that I think we all, well, it was an assumption that I think we all took, well, I definitely took for granted when I was preparing for this, but I think it's important to state that it's our responsibility to make sure that we are embedding inclusivity and accessibility into the games and adapting it where that is relevant and necessary. In terms of, and I guess this kind of leads on to the point around how do we make sure that it's inclusive to the different members around the table. I think in the game that we've developed, but also in other ones, by providing everyone with a role and that they have a responsibility to put an action forward and that they have as much say as anyone else in which action gets put to the end, it means that their voice is equal to anyone else's. So you still have to convince them, they still have to convince others, they have a kind of that vested interest in speaking, but more generally, they can't be overlooked in the discussion because you are going around the table, you are asking them for the reasons why they're putting that action forward, why is this important to them, and you're kind of helping them to voice those opinions, but in the boundaries of the game, where again, it's kind of, the setting is not trying to be, I think it was Glenn, how you put it earlier on, that task confrontation versus that emotional confrontation, and you kind of reset the scene through which that discussion is based in. So I think for me, in this, definitely in the games that I've played and based on what everyone has discussed today, it provides an opportunity for that even playing field where everyone's voice is equal to everyone else's around the table, and as they have to kind of contribute to it by bringing forward the action and being involved in the decision making, they can't as easily hide away behind maybe those who are more vocal, or others don't have the chance to kind of speak over and take the time of someone else, if that makes sense. So probably an initial introduction to that answer.
No, that's really good. And I feel very briefly, I must mention my colleague Stephen Cragg, who Maha will know, who co-designed Tap SWOT in a Box. And I have to say, he took great delight when we were at the European Transport Conference, playing the role of the Director of Transport Planning, when his boss, Fiona Brown, his real boss, Fiona Brown, was in the room as one of his minions playing the game. And so you do see some very lovely dynamics happening. Your answer, Bex, made me think, this isn't easy, is it? The responsibilities rest in the hands of the game designers. And possibly, I may be misrepresenting you all here, but in the fullness of time, Maha may be the only one of us who has a sense of qualification in being a serious gamer when she completes her PhD. So do you see any challenges that either you've been confronted with by other people, and maybe I'll come to James initially, where people are saying, well, can I take you seriously, James? Did you just dream this? Did you just cook this game up? Well, it might be fun, but is it really going to help us at all? How do you come to that position of feeling you're qualified, or can anyone put a serious game together?
Thanks, Glenn. I think it comes back to a point which I think Tom mentioned in the comments around ensuring that the outcomes of the game are clearly linked to what you're trying to achieve. So, for example, as part of the future mobility scenario game, one of the key outcomes of this out of the game is not just necessarily about how do you try and experience different perspectives of what the future is going to be, but also it identifies like a series of like policy solutions which you can then test in other realms. So for example, somebody might come up with a move in a game which like we wouldn't think of in a million years as transport planners, which we could actually look to test as part of our other ongoing work. I think there was like one example where I was working with, let's say, kind of a major company, and one of the participants of the game was basically like they were the CEO of like this major tech company, and they said, well, actually, okay, in this future, what I want to do is shut down the company completely. Just like an action which like never would have thought of in a million years. And they said, well, we're going to shut down this company completely, get rid of all of our autonomous cars, go back to kind of traditional bricks and mortar transport. And it's like, okay, well, you kind of assumed in some parts of the scenario that might be that, so that the continuation of the autonomous cars might be something that had happened, but it really got the participants to actually think, well, okay, those are potential actions which could come out of it, and those are sorts of things which we can then capture and then test as part of our other work. So I do think that there does need to be a clear output from the games which you play. I don't think they necessarily should be played for their own sake, but at the same time, I think there does need to be an understanding from professionals and people who seek to see like how games could be valuable, is that just playing the game in itself can also be a valuable activity because it gives you a new perspective on things, even if it doesn't necessarily result in an output which is necessarily shocking.
And that, I'm going to come back to you, Maha, actually, and then perhaps see also views from Claire and Charles on this. From the point of view of being a PhD candidate, clearly your examiners will need to take this seriously, this serious games lark that you're embarking on, which suggests that, and as I mentioned at the beginning, learning can be between participants from the game and by the game designers from the participants playing. But I'm sure you will need data of some sort. Have you thought ahead yet to how you envisage capturing data as part of the use of the game and the way you design the game?
Well, to start this, I first have to say that designing the game doesn't always have to be the task of the game designer. We can also co-design the game with decision makers. We can tell them, what do you need So that's what I'm doing now. I interview decision makers in the mobility department. I ask them, what do you need, how to include, what exactly to include in this game? And based on that, then I'm designing this structure of a game. Then I will go back to them, ask them, does it fit, does it not fit, and how can it help them exactly? The problem is, or the scientific addition in my perspective, is that there is always a risk with serious gaming is that it only focuses on participation as an outcome, while we don't really focus on what did this mean, what does this mean, what's the effect of the game. So that's what we have to do as game designers, is including the learning part. What do we want to learn? How can we measure it? How to assess that? So that's,
Yeah, and I think that it kind of refers back to James's points, which I'm going to use as a kind of scene setter for Claire coming in. James, as you said, you need to be very clear on the outcomes. And I think if I heard you right, Claire, you beautifully described that game that got more and more complex. But you said it wasn't necessarily, you hadn't necessarily looked at collecting data from it. So could you perhaps say a little bit about what the purpose or outcomes of your game in that context have been, and where data could play a part or why it doesn't?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have tended to use the game so far mostly with students and early career planners, where it's essentially being used as a sort of training exercise. So the aim of the game is to have gained a wider understanding of the complexity of transport. We've particularly used it with students who are, maybe very focused on one particular area. So with master's students and PhD students whose focuses may be incredibly narrow. And a lot of the purpose of the game has been to take them outside of that and to think how the tiny thing that they're doing, they might be developing the bit of technology that's going to join the grid to the electric charging points. Well, how does that fit into the way the transport network works and the wider challenges? So I think if you're with that sort of group, then the experience of playing the game is in itself sufficient. I think another way that we have talked to people about using it is as a sort of team building exercise, and where probably the goal is more to do with the group and how they work together, or as at the sort of kickoff of a project. And so it's as much about getting that interaction and getting people comfortable with one another as it is about necessarily the specific learnings from the game. But I think that some of the, I should say, we are quite at an early stage with this game, because we developed it just in time to launch in March 2020, which was not the optimal time to be launching an in-person game. And so we then obviously just sort of, I had to put it on hold and have relaunched this year and started to playing the games in real life with various groups of people. So some of the discussions that we're having are much more about how you would use it in developing strategies for cities. And I think in that scenario, you would want to put a lot more effort into capturing the points that were being discussed and writing them up. But I think that would be absolutely as doable as it is in any sort of focus group or qualitative scenario. And frankly, you could analyze it in a very, very similar way to any kind of, it's essentially a form of deliberative research, but just with a game forming the evidence that's supplied rather than the rather than technical materials. And I do think that it's really important to note that, I think we probably really overestimate the success of our existing methods in terms of the extent to which they are accessible.
That's a good point.
And, because, a lot of my work has often involved very complex modelling, and, even when we've worked hard to write that up in a more accessible way, frankly, the majority of people are not understanding that kind of information. So I think that I know Bex has done quite a lot of deliberative research, and I've done quite a lot of deliberative research, but I think the flaw in that research is often that we then, you know, the way you do deliberative research is that you put a bit of information in and then they talk about it again, but it's whether or not they've really understood that information for the next stage.
Okay, so if I, Charles, I want to come to you, sort of put a bit of a twist on this. So we're making this all sound very good, hopefully, but it can't all be, you know, sunlit uplands. Have you got any experiences of where, particularly working with the older people research that you've done, where things haven't gone to plan or people haven't all participated, or there's been discomfort in the room? Has that happened, and have you kind of been able to make sense of why that might have occurred?
Not especially with playing games. I think not any different to normal focus groups or deliberative work that we've done before. The worst was when we did the road pricing project. Glenn, you'll remember somebody overturned a plant that was on the table and jumped out the window in one focus group because they didn't want to talk about road pricing again in a deliberative workshop. So that's an example of, you know, where you're building on that conversation, like Claire said a minute ago, and you think they're going to come to something new, and the public were feeling like they were talking about the same thing time and time again. With the games I've run, I think the biggest issue I've had is running out of time when playing the games, because it seems to take a bit longer. You need a long time to play games, and especially when I'm doing it with older people, of course, they probably need more breaks than perhaps probably we all need a few breaks from stuff from time to time. But they, you know, it's probably good practice to build in extra breaks from that, and there just isn't time always to cover all the bits that you want to do in it. So that's something that comes with time. You've got to learn from that. It's a bit like James was saying at the start with some aims and objectives. Keep the game really simple to get people included and involved. Don't think you can cover loads of topics, because you can't. You'll end up only covering a very a couple of points, because it's depth rather than breadth, and that's something I've learned over time. And like we said earlier, keep it flexible, because that really gets the ability to be able to shift things if it isn't quite going to plan in the session at that time or before you do the next session. They're really the skills of any good focus group facilitator anyway, I think. So I don't think it's particularly different, apart from it probably takes longer to discuss things.
Yeah, and I suppose, I mean, listening to all of you talking about games, we've all got experiences of the games in the bargain bin at the shop because they're poorly designed and actually people didn't enjoy them, and they're not used and very, very enjoyable, very much providing the fun they intended to. And I guess there will be, you know, a graveyard of serious games which haven't necessarily worked out quite to plan. Although I know in the case of James's, you've worked very hard to evolve it, James. And I don't know whether there's anything you can say on that, because one of my concerns, we haven't seen it come up yet, I think, in the chat, to suggest people are looking at this conversation very skeptically. But this is starting to sound like a lot of hard work, and it's pretty complex, isn't it? I mean, you can't just pick up one of these things and start getting value from it. So shall I just give it a wide berth? I mean, is it tempting to give it a wide berth, James? Why should people take serious games seriously?
Well, naturally, of course, I'd say no, but obviously I've got to justify why. With serious games, it's something which you do get a lot of value out of it, so long as you can put the effort into making a good game that works well. Now, obviously, what a lot of game makers do is they literally do that to make it easy. They make it really simple to do. They identify. So a good game should identify what the ultimate aim is and what the ultimate objective is. It should provide basic rules on how to do things, what not to do, what different roles are, and it provides basic tools which the participants can then use, and then people can then play the game in their own way. And identifying what sort of games kind of do. Identifying what sort of games can do that can be quite tricky, but again, it's something which you only then really can learn through experience of doing outcome experience and experimentation, and it's really easy to get put off by a bad game. As I mentioned in my opening monologue, we've all played a bad game at some point, but that then doesn't stop us in trying out something new and giving it a go and putting in the effort on the understanding that the potential outcomes from it could be could become quite something. I should also go and mention that we've actually been doing serious games for far longer than we can think we actually have. I've literally got in front of me a copy of the Bolishina card game, which was published in 1937 to teach people about new road rules, including things like zebra crossings, kind of those kind of sorts of things. And when that was published at the time, they had no idea whether or not it would work, but actually it really kind of did take on, because again, it kept the game mechanics simple and it identified what you want to try and get out of it. And as long as you kind of keep to that and you are willing to experiment with it, then you will get lots out of games.
I love that reminder of how old serious games are, and which maybe suggests we've forgotten how to have fun, at least in our sector. And Maha, I was very interested that you pointed out, in fact, as Claire did for the energy sector, but you plucked an example for us from the water sector. Is your impression that serious games are much more normalised in other sectors compared to transport, or have you not had a chance yet to see that clearly enough?
I think they are more in like climate change adaptation, risk management. They are more into this. Less, I guess we have less serious games in the transport department. Yes, I agree with you.
Yeah. And any reasons for that? I mean, maybe is it the complexity of the problems, the wickedness of them? I mean, Claire, perhaps you want to pick up on that as well, because I think you were, in your introductory remarks, very much alluding to the types of challenges we're now wrestling with.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know, isn't it? But I think that it's perhaps partly, I think it's partly just habit. If something has always been done, it stays being done. And because this hasn't always been done, it just doesn't get done. And people are nervous about trying something new. I think that realistically, a lot of the work in the transport industry is commissioned by government or local government and regional government teams, and they are inevitably going to be somewhat risk averse because it's public money. They're heavily scrutinized for how they spend money, for what they're doing. They're under a number of legal constraints. I think it can be, I mean, I speak as someone who's worked in, on that side of the fence for a long time. It can be quite difficult to innovate because you don't have a lot of space for getting things wrong. And certainly my experience, which sounds like it's reflected for others, is that I think that serious games done well can be really, really beneficial, but it was pretty hard developing this game so that it worked and that it was simple, because there's so much complexity, and stripping that complexity out and working it through. And I think it's difficult for the commissioners in this sector to take some of those risks, and I think that is quite a difficult challenge. Whereas if you have got to run a big consultation on a controversial scheme and you follow agreed best practice for the public sector and you follow it to the letter, your lawyers are going to be happy, your political masters are going to be happy. I think that's a lot of it, and I think that's quite a difficult barrier to overcome. There's not a lot of money sloshing around, and it's a big deal for people to take a risk with that.
Just building on that, before I come to you, Bex, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting history here, but I certainly, the story stuck with me of a young professor, well, before he was professor, I guess, a young Peter Jones, who presented at a conference, I'm told, on his focus group research. And at the end, the chair of the session said, "Well, Mr. Jones, I'm sure that would have been of interest to somebody. But anyway, moving on." And this sort of very dismissive, disparaging sense of, this is flaky, methodologically obscure stuff. We want to get back to the serious business of well, now it would perhaps be big data or, major full-scale surveys. Bex, I'm wondering, in the world that you inhabit, which in one sense could appear to be very technologically focused and perhaps with more of an engineering mindset, and I can perhaps say that as a graduate civil engineer, but how have you found the reception to what you've been developing, and obviously your role in behavioural research within CCAV? How have you found the reception to the proposition of your game, and do you see any sense that it might capture the imagination to become more normalised, or is it a flash in the pan?
I think it's definitely not been without its challenges and without its difficulties. I think, and this is touching on what a lot of people have mentioned beforehand, the complexity of some of the transport challenges. And I work in an environment that is very future looking, where by nature, I think the idea of innovation is a little bit more welcomed, because we know that when we look at the future, innovation is a core part of that, whatever form that may be, whether that's innovation in vehicles, in infrastructure, in services, and all the sort of associated elements that go with that. And I think as a result of that, there is naturally a bit more openness towards the idea of being a little bit more innovative in terms of the way that we do things, which is why the idea of the project that we've just done, where the game was part of it, but we also had things, for instance, like taking self-driving vehicles around the country, using EEG headsets to monitor how people respond to technology, didn't go down with a complete absolute no-go, we're shutting this down, as a way of actually being we have gaps in our evidence, there are limitations towards what we're getting, what are the ways through which we can help to address that. Now, it makes it sound like it was quite plain sailing. It's not, as I'm sure we will all know from the various research grants that we put forward, through the various proposals that we put forward, both in my current role, but also both within academia and sort of private research. You have to demonstrate impact. You have to demonstrate why you're doing this and the value of doing this. And I think it kind of goes to, if you can goes back to that overall question, why should we take serious games seriously? And I think if we can demonstrate the added value that they bring, the different types of data that they bring, the types of data that, and all of those points that we said at the beginning, why do we do them? Why do we use these methods over another one? And this kind of idea that I said around having it in your methods toolkit, that serious games are one part of a bigger pool of research methods, and what they can bring, other methods can't. And so it's important not to dismiss them just because they are challenging and complex, and they will take a lot of time to develop and perfect. But that iterative nature of research is very, well, it's a guiding principle within research. We always look to improve and amend on what we've done before. So serious games are just another mechanism through which to do that. So I think it isn't without its challenges, but I think that especially given the complexity of the environment that we're in, when we look at the complexity of transport, all of the different things that have to be taken into consideration, all the different agents that need to be considered, there's a realization that just always using the same methods isn't going to help us to address those evidence gaps. And so I think that there is more of an openness to look at different methods of innovation and how we can use those to help build up that evidence base.
I suppose, and of course, what you're all demonstrating beautifully is the diversity of application and the nature of games that can be used. And I guess in a kind of educational sense, it's lower risk, lower exposure. And I'm thinking across to some of the conversations at James's mobility camp in Bristol a few weeks ago about the challenges of engaging the public, and the very heated exchanges we've seen on low traffic neighbourhoods. Could you imagine local authorities and indeed local stakeholders taking seriously the use of a serious game to bring differences of opinion, heated differences of opinion together on a very personal issue in someone's neighbourhood, as a way forwards? Because it does seem as though at the moment we're struggling with current methods or current mainstream methods to make that work. Claire, I'm seeing your head nodding vigorously, and then I don't know whether Charles was as well, but do you want to have a go at that? Can we take on the really tough things with serious games?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I've been thinking about a lot, because I've been thinking about some of the really challenging stakeholder meetings that I've been in, and I've not I've not been working on the low traffic neighbourhoods, but obviously we've all read about that in the press and this kind of incredible hostility, and really how there's a narrative of unpopularity in the press, and it doesn't matter how much evidence the transport authorities are putting out on how popular they are, how the research is showing that the vast majority of people support them. Last week there were literally children barricading a road to stop a scheme being removed, but the narrative is still overwhelmingly that they are a failure, that they are an imposition, that sort of their big government imposing on a local neighborhood. So I think I would definitely agree with you that the current methods are not succeeding in some of these controversial issues. That's certainly true in the pricing, the world of road pricing that I do have been working in more. I think that with members of the public it could be effective. You would need some very clear, some strong facilitators and some very clear guidelines and a bit of filtering as to who gets to be in that room. I think the group that is still an open question in my mind is the sort of professional stakeholder groups that are often very challenging to engage with, and that sort of represent particular interests, and whether they would see it as in some way patronizing. I think that could be quite challenging, but if you could make it work, it could be incredibly rewarding, because the problem with those discussions is that they often just go around the same circular loop over and over and over again. And if you can do something that breaks that discussion and just gets people to step back, think differently, just take it as read that discussion has already been had, that view has been heard, and start to look more at solutions. Because a huge issue with a lot of our stakeholder engagement is that what it involves is people telling us how much they hate our idea and not telling us what a workable solution looks like.
It's, as you've been talking, there's a couple of comments in the chat bar, but the messaging issue comes through strongly for me. I was imagining the Daily Mail headline, "Transport planners playing games with our lives," and yet war games is, one of them, one of the early serious game applications. What could be more serious than, strategizing in war scenarios? But yes, I mean, as Khalid has said in the chat bar, it would be very difficult for the decision makers to take decisions based on outcomes of a game. I wonder, Charles, and then perhaps James, has that been an issue for you, your results being taken seriously when you come back to the decision maker, or perhaps the client in some cases?
Yeah, definitely. I think we still champion quantitative or data that comes from quantitative findings, or evidence from quantitative findings, over qualitative for a start, particularly in transport, but in lots of domains. And you're right. I mean, imagine the Daily Mail headline saying the Department for Transport funds people to play games, rather than funding cost benefit analysis or big data analysis and things like that. But like we said, those current methods haven't really got us in a tremendously great place at the moment. So there is a chance to perhaps think about different ways of leveling up. I don't think calling it games particularly helps very much, but I mean, that is what they are at the end of the day. But what else could we dress it up as? Dialogue or discursive approaches or iterative focus groups. There's just got to be a better way of trying to sell our wares, really, and that's down to us a little bit to promote that, I think, and to evidence how important our type of method and evidence is.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a competition initiated by Charles there for replacing the phrase "serious games." James, do you want to enter the competition, or do you want to offer another view about the challenges?
Personally, I think games is actually a really good description and really accessible, but that's just me. So the first thing which I would say is that if you're basing decisions come purely off a game, then you really should not be doing that. And I think any of us game makers will be saying exactly the same. You don't necessarily make decisions come based off a game. You've got to consider a wide variety of evidence in order to come to your policy recommendations and also to recommendations on what you need to do. And you need to understand that games are part of that evidence base, and they can make you think about things in different ways, and they make you explore things in different ways, but they can't make a decision for you. It's similar to a traffic model. It can't make a decision for you. It just shows you how something could play out and gets you to think about things differently. So that is where the value of this game is. But if you're relying on a game to make a decision, you have slightly bigger problems than whether or not a game is right, frankly.
Well, you're in the closing minutes, you're tempting me to be naughty now by starting to refer to traffic models as games, which might get me into trouble. So I won't say that, strike that from the record. Look, we're almost out of time. As ever, time has flown. I hope it has for the audience. And I'm sorry we've not been able to pick up all of your points that have been coming through to us. But if I can just go for a quick fire round of our panelists in no more than sort of 40 seconds each. What's something for you that you're taking away from today's conversation that's perhaps new, or a point you really want the audience to take away from their engagement today? Let's start with Claire.
Challenging. Right. I think that this has strengthened my resolve that the serious games are a good idea. It's fascinating to see how other people have been using them in the real world. I think that it's made me realise that we have perhaps not thought enough about codifying the outputs in our game, even though it would be eminently possible, and that's something that I'm going to go away and work on, because I think that's a really, really interesting point to make the game more deliverable in the environment that we work in.
Great, thanks, Claire. Charles.
I think it's been great just to be able to listen to other people thinking in the same kind of ways as myself for a change. It's really nice to hear, and then also to hear there's different perspectives on how games work and how they run. But similar shared stuff about them being great for leveling up power and allowing lots of people to talk and bring their opinions across. And therefore, regardless of what might be the current discourse on how important they are or not, there really is something really important about the evidence that comes from these things, both the evidence itself as something that could inform policy and practice, but also how it informs other models, how it informs other parts of the evidence process along the way. So yeah, it's really good to discuss and work out their value and their role.
Great, thank you. Maha.
Well, the idea of selling the game to players, this is something that was new to me, because I know the people I'm dealing with from my very small perspective. I know that they are very excited about playing the games, but I don't know what other people would think of. So selling the game as if it's a very serious thing, it's not just a game, was just a takeoff for me today. And also this we need more time for the game. I know that a lot of people we invite to play a game, they say, no, we don't want to. Oh, we will come for half an hour or something, but then they spend a full day. So this also puts a challenge on how long should the game be? Would they be excited to play it more, or would they want to leave after half an hour?
Yeah, we want to steer clear of Monopoly, perhaps, or not. There's a divisive game. James.
Not a divisive game if you keep winning it. Anyway, so two key takeaways from me from 40 seconds. Firstly, it's for us game designers to reiterate the point that we've got to design our games in an inclusive way. We can come up with the absolutely best game in the world, which could achieve every single outcome which we want it to do, but we've got to design it in an inclusive way with a wide variety of audiences. And the second takeaway, which I'm really keen for people on the call to think about, is have a think about how games and how the approach which they in which they deliver and which they engage people could add value to your transport policy and your transport decision making, even if it's just in a small way. Just go away and think about it.
Very good. Thanks, James. Bex?
Turns out going last is quite hard because everyone said the points I wanted to put forward, but I'll have a go. I think one of the ones for me is around that inclusivity and that inclusiveness element, around ensuring not just that we level up the playing field in terms of people who are in the room, but ensuring the diversity of those in the room, and looking at ways through which we ensure that whoever those stakeholders may be, to make sure that, going back to that point initially made around building up the robust and diverse evidence base that we need to ensure that those who are providing us with that evidence are diverse and representative. So that will be my first one. And I think the second point is going back to that, how nice it is to talk about something where we've clearly all got an agreement on the value added that these games bring, but we've all got slightly different perspectives, and being able to learn from each other to kind of really identify what is the added value of these games and what are their roles in building up that evidence base will definitely be one of those second takeaway.
Great, thank you. And as we've gone through the conversation, many of the games perhaps quite naturally are future facing. They're dealing with the challenges of planning. And that reminds me of what we've seen happening with scenario planning, or scenario development and planning, which certainly from my perspective has gone from relative obscurity in transport through to becoming, common parlance and mainstream. So I think my great hope from today is that, this is part of a journey where we'll see these sorts of creative methods become more and more mainstream and seen for the value that they really can offer. So with that, from Serious Gamers Anonymous, I will hand back to Brogan after saying a big thank you to our panel and a huge thank you to our audience this afternoon. Thank you all. Brogan, back to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, guys. That was a great conversation. Some really awesome questions coming out of the chat. So thanks again for your time, and we'll see you at the next PTRC Fireside Chat.
Thanks. Bye, folks.